happens to be a member of the Rhode Island Builders Association. We have somebody who's there to represent Forest Habitat, an environmental organization, land preservation, forest landowners, the forest products industry. We have a logger. I'm the chair of my expertise is land use, and of course, TJ. So the Forest Conservation Commission, our primary charge was to really define the most important forest land in Rhode Island. And before we get into that, I think it's important to understand how the act defined forest land. It's really, and this definition goes back to the Farm, Forest, and Open Space Act from the 80s, so it isn't necessarily new, but as you can see, it has to be, for the purposes of the way the state is defining it, the forest land has to be at least 10 acres of land or larger, bearing a dense growth of trees, etc. So establishing the most important forest definition is really a daunting task because Rhode Island, as you can see, is approximately 56% forested. There's just about 368,000 forest acres. 70% of that is pretty much unprotected, undeveloped. So there's a lot to think about. And there's also this great report that came out in, it was actually 2020. I was a member of the advisory committee that put this together, and it does an excellent job of walking through the many important values that Rhode Island's forests have. So with that, we tried to come up with criteria on how we could try to define Rhode Island's most important forest. We use clean air, clean water, economic importance, the ability for climate change mitigation, habitat, human health, and well-being. And a lot of these criteria came right out of the Act itself. From that, we developed a draft of proposed most important forest types. As you can see, the 6 types here: core forest, old growth and old growth forest characteristics, most productive forest soils. Think of these as sort of like Rhode Island's forest version of the prime agricultural soil. Forest to protect drinking water supplies, Rhode Island natural heritage rare forest types, and then this broad category called urban forest. This is just showing you approximately what the core forest might look like. That's about 39% of all forest in Rhode Island. This is quickly showing you the forest to protect drinking water supplies. And this is showing you the area very briefly that we would consider urban. This is using U.S. Commerce Department definition of urban. So how is this definition going to be used? Well, the Forest Conservation is not proposing any particular use. In fact, we don't have any statutory authority to require anyone to use this definition. Potential uses might include the uses that you might expect have been used for Rhode Island's most important prime farm soils and soils of unique statewide importance. And those criteria over the years have been used for ranking parcels to purchase. We would expect land trusts, the state, to use this as just one of the criteria that they would consider if they're going to be acquiring forest land. And it can also be used for guidance for municipal land use decisions. Towns in their comprehensive plans are required to map important natural resources. Our hope is that the most important forests within that particular municipality will henceforth be mapped. So the next steps, all the comments that we received tonight, and if at all possible, if you have written comments, that would be extremely helpful for us because we need to share this with the other members of the Forest Conservation Commission. The goal is to have a final definition in early 2024. And then once that's done, the Forest Conservation Commission will work with other partners to encourage people to begin to use this definition. With that, we'll turn to your comments, and I'll turn it back to TJ.
Thank you, Scott. Yeah, so we're open for comments. If someone has a comment or a question, please unmute yourself. It's easy if you guys raise your hands once someone is talking so that I can then call on you to do that so we don't have everyone talking out at once. But if anyone would like to start, please raise your hand. You're good, Greg.
Sure. I looked at it and you said you have, and your ranking was core forests and then old growth. And I have questions about that. I mean, it almost sometimes seems like old growth would be more important, though in Rhode Island, it's probably such limited amounts of it that you think the bigger areas might be more important. Could you discuss how you guys came to that ranking? I mean, the other ones all look fine, but those two, could be switched.
So, Scott, I don't know if you want to comment on that, but I believe when you look at the definition as we have it posted online, it's just a numbered list. It isn't in order of importance. So core forest shows up as 1, old growth shows up as 2, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're looking at core forests any more importantly than old growth.
Okay.
Just the way that it's formatted.
That's correct. Think of all of these as all these forest types would be considered Rhode Island's most important forest.
Thanks, Greg.
Hi, I'm calling in by phone. Could you let me know when I might speak so I don't preempt anybody else with their hands raised?
Yeah, you're good to go now.
Okay. I have a multitude of questions, so
yeah. I'm sorry. Could you just state your name for us?
Barbara Walsh.
Okay.
I will be writing comments, but there's a couple that I would like to just start with. One is the old growth definitions. I find this definition to be so conservative that there can't possibly be any old growth in the state if you use this definition. When you say a property can't have any natural disaster affect it, you're saying it couldn't have been struck by lightning, which everybody now says is a good thing and should not have been suppressed in the past. And so if within a parcel some trees were burned and are now regrowing, that would not be considered part of an old growth cluster, if you will, or woodlands. The age by which you can't have any kind of stone wall or basement or anything like that goes back to the 1600s. So now you're saying nothing before, the 1600s, since the 1600s, can really be considered, even if it was abandoned in the 1700s. It almost seems to me, and this is just a subjective opinion here, that you're attempting to put a definition out there that will not provide protection for anything that, using a different definition, would be considered old growth worthy of protection. Other people say 100 years old for tree age, others say 150, others go with girth and canopy height. But with your definition, it's almost like you are purposefully saying there will be no old growth so designated in the state of Rhode Island. Why are you so conservative about this?
I can start and TJ jump in.
Yeah.
Barbara, first of all, that's a good comment. And that wasn't our intent. If you look at that carefully, that definition is broken up into 2 categories. The first is what we would consider, what a lot of the literature considers true old growth, meaning it hasn't been impacted by humans in the past. And in Rhode Island, honestly, we don't think we have much of that at all. Because just
Do you
about
think there's
everything,
any?
well, we don't know, but it's not likely we have much that has never been disturbed by humans since our colonial heritage. But if you look at the other part of the definition, it's that forest that has old growth forest characteristics. It has been disturbed at some point in time. It could have been created post-colonial Rhode Island. And that's where you get into a much broader category of forest types that we would more than likely have in Rhode Island. And again, we probably spent more time on that particular definition than all the other definitions combined. We did get some input from Nathan Cornell, who I believe you know. He did give us very extensive written comments. His last written comments have not been incorporated into this yet, because the Forest Conservation Commission wanted to look at all of the public comments before we began to make revisions to this. I hope that helps.
What I worry about, though, Scott, is, I'm a citizen. I'm not a forester. But I have opinions about what should be protected, what kind of property should be concerned by state and local efforts, putting our own dollars, private dollars, into trying to protect certain tracts. And I don't understand why a state entity under which you exist, the commission, would feel the need to be so conservative in any way that you rule out the protection of anything that, if it's 200 years old, why isn't that good enough in our state where we have so little old anything in terms of trees and habitat and biodiversity? It just seems to me like these definitions are going to be used by people who will then say, oh, well, it's not this and it's not that, so let's go, log it. So that if we can't attach a value to it, given the definitions you are so defining thus far, then it doesn't have value and it will be open to commercial use because the definitions are so conservative. I think DEM, the Forest Commission, all of the folks as participants on this, except maybe those representing economic interests, should be erring on the side of protection as much as possible of habitat. We're not, even you guys aren't talking about biodiversity, but where do you think animals live? These are their habitats. And other than protecting the cottontail, even DEM doesn't talk about biodiversity and protection of anything.
Barbara, with respect to biodiversity, that's what the core forest is. I used to work for DEM. Before I left, I actually worked on that concept of identifying core forest in the Rhode Island Wildlife Action Plan. The thought process being there, and again, a core forest, for those who aren't familiar with that definition, it would be an unfragmented tract of forest land that's 250 acres or greater. The wildlife biologists, and we received a lot of feedback on this definition, felt that the larger the parcel, the more value it had for wildlife habitat. That's why core forest is the principal reason that core forest is in here as a designated most important forest, because our biologists believe that collectively, that's probably where some of Rhode Island's best habitat is. It doesn't mean that that's the only habitat we want to try to preserve, but that was their belief that if we can protect these core forests, we're doing a pretty good job of protecting good habitat types in Rhode Island.
I don't disagree with that, but the problem is that one core forest tract is in sort of southern Rhode Island, and once you hit Kent County, Providence County, Bristol County, there's not much left. So where I live in Warwick, a 100-acre tract is not considered that valuable, and yet it's the biggest tract we would have in the entire city of Warwick. 250 acres only exists in that one place.
Right. And that's why we have a call out specifically for urban forests. And if you look at that definition, essentially what the commission is saying that is acting like you were saying that we were being too conservative. I think we're being extremely liberal in the urban areas and saying all trees, all forests that fall within that urban census area are important and should be included in Rhode Island's most important forests. So that would include essentially every tree in Warwick should be taken into consideration as something that's important. All of the green space in our urban areas, we're taking account of and making sure that cities and towns know that that green space is important and something that needs to be considered when looking at development. So that 100 acres in Warwick, you're 100% correct. It's extremely important to the community, and we feel it's just as important, and that's why we've written this definition to include all of that space.
Well, then why wouldn't Morley Field be protected?
I'm not familiar with that exact location. I'm sorry.
That's a plot in Pawtucket
Uh-huh.
that is about, I believe, 5 acres, and it's people are trying to allow it to be paved over for a parking lot.
Right.
And it's
So-
an urban site that provides some woodlands and
Mhm.
some recreational area for kids.
Yeah.
And there's nothing similar to it within a mile and a half. So that area should have been protected, and yet, as far as I know, I haven't heard lately, but I think the city and the state are still interested in allowing it to be paved over as a parking lot.
Right. So if it's not state-owned property and it's owned by the municipality, that's a Pawtucket question about their
Yes.
development wants and wishes. And what this definition would do would be guidance for communities like Pawtucket to understand the importance of something like that park to its community. We're not condoning or condemning any of that type of work that's going on. What we're doing is, showcasing the importance of forests. The commission, DEM, and the state, for the most part, doesn't really have purview over what privately owned property gets developed. If it is allowable, it's an allowable use. What we're trying to do is showcase that, these spaces are important places that should be preserved.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Greg, did you have another question?
No, I was
Hi,
gonna
yes.
add something about Morley Field if you needed it, but it doesn't seem like I need to.
That's okay. Thanks, Greg. We had another question on the phone.
Yes, this is Michelle Comar, and I gladly will wait my turn, but I'm just on the phone, not on Zoom.
Yeah, you're okay. You're ready to
Okay,
go.
great, thank you. Hi. Yep, I'm Michelle Comar, Warwick resident, and I echo Barbara Walsh's concerns as well. I think the definitions are too restrictive, so you're going to get a very small sample. So I have a question to ask. It's kind of a test, which would be, has the commission looked at, out of the 50, I think it's 56% coverage of forest in Rhode Island, what percentages of those forests would fall into each of these categories as defined as they are right now? And I think you unintentionally maybe eliminate quite a few that you probably mentally would have been counting, but the definitions are just too restrictive. So has anyone done like a percentage count to see, out of the 56% coverage of forests in the state, what fits in each category, slice of the pie?
We can get that information back to you on some of this. Definitely the core forests, that's easily mapped, and we can get the acreage for you on that. There's also other areas that need to be taken into consideration that are conserved that would not be part of this definition. There's many acres that don't fall within this definition of most important forests that are already conserved land. Either it's through land trusts or privately conserved property, state-owned property that might not fall within this. So I can provide you with an overall conservation protection layer that shows how many acres of forest land is in conservation in Rhode Island in general. And we can definitely do it for the core forests. For old growth, we don't know. It's estimated that there's less than 1% of Rhode Island's forests that are over 100 years in general. That's not a term that we're using to define it, but so I can tell you that for old growth, it's less than 1% without knowing exactly where those locations are. And then we can also give you the amount of forests that are within urban areas. That's an easy thing to define. We don't have those numbers here to discuss this evening. And then in terms of the drinking protection water supply areas, these are all mappable locations that we don't necessarily have, but that is something that is a charge of us as well, is to identify and to map these areas. So it's not something that we are not thinking of. We're just waiting until we have a defined definition so that we can then work within those boundaries to figure out the data, because it's not a simple button click kind of thing. It's a little bit of work to get around that.
Also,
Okay, I will
Michelle,
be submitting written comments before the December 8th deadline. Was somebody answering my question? I'm sorry to interrupt.
yeah, keep in mind that there's also a most important forest soils designation. And again, it hasn't been entirely mapped yet. We looked at some prototypes because we wanted to know, would that extend the most important forest category into more urban and suburban areas because of the good soils that might be there? All it would have to be is 10 acres or more. The answer is yes. So you're going to see, because based upon the soils in a particular municipality, and if it's forested, you're going to see parcels pop out that aren't particularly large. They would just need to be 10 acres or greater. So again, I think when you see this in its totality, I don't think you're going to see that it's conservative. Frankly, we were concerned that we would get criticism in the other direction, that perhaps we're designating too much forest land as most important. So we're trying to strike that balance.
Okay, I know.
Piggyback on what Michelle was asking and what
Go
you
ahead,
just
Barbara.
answered. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Barbara. Go ahead.
The 10 acres that you just referenced, given soils and all that, two comments. One is the soil data is almost 50 years old. Don't you think it would have changed given climate change, pesticide use, and all kinds of other reasons in the last 40-something years?
Not according to the soil scientists that we spoke to at the USDA. Soils don't change that dramatically.
All right, so they're saying that that would all still be valid data.
Yes.
And the 10 acres, when you deal with urban areas, I don't know where you find 10 acres unless it's Swan Point. To me,
keep
that's
in mind,
too
we have a
large.
different,
I
urban
think,
is defined, Barbara, I hate to cut you off, or urban is defined differently. We're saying if you're in that urban area, all of the forest, I mean, that's, again, I don't know how we can be any broader, are important for a lot of, because trees have such tremendous value in urban areas.
so there's no restriction on lot size for urban areas.
No, so we're not defining what a forest is in an urban area. What we're defining is that it should be taken into consideration as something that's important. And what we're saying is all trees within the US Census urban area should be considered under this definition as important trees that should be looked at under that lens.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right, Barbara, if you don't mind, I have a few more comments. I think that exercise of seeing what percentage or how many acres that fit each category, I think that would be a good reality check, because I think the definitions are too strict in some respects. Mr. Richard Langseth submitted comments. He passed them on to me. I kind of agree with some of them. I think some of these are reading as requirements where they should be. Yeah, they could be there. It's okay, but you're specifying requirements and how to discount these types of forests because they have stone walls or some other kind of man-made intrusion. I mean, that's kind of hard in Rhode Island and New England in general. But I'll have specifics about why I think this is too restrictive. So that's one concern. The other concern I have is, as a wetland scientist, I'm used to reviewing definitions with regulations. We update the freshwater wetland regulations. The definitions are there to update, to supplement, and describe what's in the support, what's in the regulations. I don't know what these definitions are going to be used for. And it's not clear in the state legislation that directed the formation of this forest commission. And I'm leery about that. I kind of want to know, and the nature of how it's written, are we protecting or are we discounting forests? Are these going to be used for land development regulations? Are they going to be used for grant qualification? Any kind of regulations? This is why I'm leery about just doing definitions, which are not hard and fast in, an exact science. And I'm sure you've researched other definitions maybe from other states. So I think it's premature. It's what my punchline is, to develop definitions without what are they going to be used for. So that's a major comment I have. And I know you're following state directive, but it took DEM maybe at least 10 years under the direction of state law to upgrade their DEM freshwater wetland regulations. And they did it the right way. They had many workshops, comment periods, explained the reg changes, and it took 10 years. So I don't know what the deadline, is there a specific deadline you're charged with completing this task of definitions?
There is no deadline, but, prudent to what we're being asked, we're working as fast as we can within our limits to do what's asked of us rather than waiting to do it. And to speak to your comment about how this is going to be used, or the fact that we might be doing something that's not necessarily conserving land, or stopping land from being developed. Right now in Rhode Island, as you know, being a wetland scientist, unless it's within certain wetlands regulations, pretty much most of the state can be developed. And in order to make a change to that is something that is much larger and a much bigger conversation than what we're talking about. What we're doing is creating a definition that helps decision makers understand the importance of and what exists within our natural lands, particularly in the forests. So that's kind of where we begin and end with this definition.
Right, and I shouldn't make the comparison to the freshwater wetland regs too deeply, because that's only used for the state wetlands permitting. We don't have any local jurisdiction for wetlands anymore, so it's only used for that purpose. And it's commonplace to have definitions differ across the board depending what regulation or what they're being used for. That happens a lot. That's why you have a glossary of terms for whatever regulation or use you're using. It's tailored to that use. But these definitions could be used outside of DEM regulations. They could be used by municipalities, by very competitive grant qualifications. And right now it's tough for these small forests to get grant monies. I've investigated that myself. And so these urban forests are tough to score high because they're smaller, because the area's been developed. So I just am very put up the caution sign of not knowing how these definitions are going to be used. I think we're premature to jump into this if there's no deadline. then I would just study more about how these are going to be used. Maybe you'll get another directive from the General Assembly this session of how to use them. But I'm very leery about just open-ending, putting definitions together and not knowing where they're going to be used for.
Michelle, I know
move
you're
on.
probably familiar with the definition of prime agricultural land. It's been around for, I don't know, probably over 40
Correct.
years. And I think we would anticipate that these definitions would be used in a very similar manner. Again, the commission has no statutory authority to require people to use these and how they use them, to promulgate regulations, nor does DEM. But again, people can use them as one criteria if they wish in ranking parcels to acquire. Municipalities can use them to try to determine what are the, what if they have a lot of forest in your community, what of that forest, which are perhaps the most important. We've given them that guidance. I've been working with municipalities for over 40 years, and in various techniques, land use techniques, they've been seeking that kind of guidance. This gives them something to go on. Do they have to use it verbatim? No, they don't. They can modify it if they wish. If they don't feel the definition of core forest meets their needs for land acquisition or any other purpose, they can modify it. There's nothing etched in stone that says they have to use it exactly the way we're proposing it. That would be a municipal decision to make. But this is guidance. And again, we anticipate it to be used in a very similar manner as the way prime agricultural soils have been used successfully, again, for over 40 years.
Well,
Can I throw out a quick question again to piggyback on what Michelle's asking?
Go ahead. Go ahead, Barbara.
Have you considered the importance of things like migratory bird routes in your categories, your several categories of what is deemed to be valuable?
Yes, so that is included for the most part within the core forest definition. Those core forests were identified through the Wildlife Action Plan, which took into consideration migratory bird patterns. So a lot of previous research and a lot of information is tied into that one phrase of core forests. It's all based off of what was already established within our Wildlife Action Plan, which again, its main focus was wildlife and habitat protection.
So only for the core forest?
Right, which is connected into a lot of those areas that are for migratory birds, correct?
Well, not in the south of southern Rhode Island. There is no core forest once you hit Kent County, Providence County, Bristol County. There is no core forest.
Right. So if there is an area that you think is important that we should take into consideration, we would gladly take that into consideration. If you have a specific type of forest or location that you think should be identified, I'd welcome that.
Well, I don't know off the top of my head, but I would think Charles, I forget his last name, at Audubon, Clarkson, is doing a lot of research in this area, and I would hope he might have something to add here.
Mm-hmm. And we've sent this out to Audubon for their comments. We've sent it out to pretty much every environmentally based nonprofit in the state, and we've gotten some comments back from them. Yeah.
It's important to note we do have a member of the Audubon Society, Scott Ruin, who is a member of the Forest Conservation Commission.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if that kind of information was added to the value, the list of values of what should be considered in determining importance. Because it's not written, the little bit that I read doesn't seem to include anything like that.
We can take a look at adding some more information if there's something that you could send along, definitely.
Okay.
Okay, my other comment, next comment is,
Can I just have you pause for 1 second? I have a comment or a question from Rob Bauer from the Situate Land Trust.
Yeah, thank you,
Yeah.
Scott and TJ. Just a couple of questions for clarification of the core forest definition. So the phrase unbroken by development, is any road, is that considered development, or does it have to have residential components?
So
I mean, I'm thinking of, you know, greenways that we protect that often are split by roads, but they may be pretty rural in character.
So yeah, roads are taken into consideration, and that's
Okay.
used as a buffer from the road. So anything, if there's a road going through it, like on either side of Route 6, you know, those are two separate areas unless they combine at another location.
Okay, and what about recreational areas, parks and so forth? Are they considered development?
Yes and no. So unless they are forested, if they are forested, like areas of Lincoln Woods and things like that, if they are connected to that, they would be part of that location. I know that there is some spots around Goddard Park that are part of the core forest, I believe. So yeah, they're not excluded because they're identified as a park. It's really a GIS layer based identifier. If there's trees present, there's kind of a line drawn to see if it fits an acreage definition or not.
Okay, and then I know the definition allows multiple parcels. I assume ownership doesn't matter, right? I mean, that's the challenge of the towns and owners to collaborate on protecting.
Yeah, correct. Yeah,
Forest.
this has no ownership level data connected to it. It's strictly looking at it as one giant block of Rhode Island. There's no parcel break.
Right. Of course, Situate Land Trust, for example, only owns or manages a few hundred acres, but we often abut Providence Waterland where there may be some potential contiguous core forest, but and then of course crossing town lines as well, Foster and Gloucester. But when the definition is complete and final, will then DEM develop maps of core forests in the state?
I'm sorry, can you ask that again about the maps?
So I'm wondering if when the definition is complete and finalized, will the DEM compile a map to designate core forests in the state?
Yes, so that I actually put a link in the chat that you can
Okay.
look at where the core forests are mapped now. That's something that we already have mapped.
Okay, great.
But any of the other mappable pieces of this definition are going to be included in an overall map that folks will be able to take a look at the layers. But yeah, if you look into the chat, Hal had asked a question about that, and I had given them a link to our resource center with all of our maps. And one of those areas under the conservation opportunity areas, they showcase where the core forests are now. And you can zoom in and look at the roads and things like that, how it's broken up.
Very good. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Hillary, do you have a question?
Oops. Hi.
Hi, Scott. Hi, TJ. It's Hillary, Fortune, Bill Fortune, and Mark Tremblay. We're all sitting on this together.
Oh, hey guys.
And, but we're doing very good.
Hi.
So good presentation. Bob, the question you asked was the questions pretty much I was going to ask about the timeline and who's going to be responsible for the mapping. And so what do you think timeline when the mapping is actually going to be done, once you've made that definition?
So again, I think for us, that's going to be something that we're going to try to do as soon as possible and get the ground running with this. A lot of the work is going to be done internally in DEM. Some of it's going to have to be ground truthed. I think that's going to take a little bit longer. But we right now, honestly, there's not a timeline that we have that we're going to say it's going to be done by, June 1st or something like that. But it's definitely top of our priority list once the definition has been codified for us to be able to map anything that we can map. It might require us to go into contract with a third party. Something like that might take a little bit longer. But yeah, our hope is that it's not going to take much longer than the definition itself.
I mean, as far as the soil mapping go, for instance, I mean, is that something you can get NRCS to help you with? I mean, is this something DEM could do internally or?
Yeah, I think that's going to be definitely partnership with NRCS, and if
Okay.
not them, another third party. I don't think we have the bandwidth internally to do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. That's it. Thanks.
Thanks, you guys. So I think, Michelle, you had another question you wanted to follow up?
Yeah, these are easier. I'm looking at the September 28th meeting minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not quite sure if these were incorporated into the definitions or not. There was, first of all, there were some written comments, I assume by agencies. And I was going to ask if they could be available on your website so that, number one, public commenters can learn. And number two, we don't repeat a lot. So it'd be helpful if those written comments came in, that you can post them on your website before, or if you can do them as soon as possible, that'd be great. Where do the comments come from?
So I don't know if, Scott, if you can correct me or not, if that information is public information that we can showcase or not. I'm not sure.
That might be a question for your legal counsel, but I think
Yeah.
some of those comments came from members of the Woodland Partnership. I made a presentation on this draft definition last summer. We just asked professional people who have a good background in forestry to see if we were on the right track. And I think what we heard from them is, yes, we are. And they had some comments that I think that's what you're referring to at that September meeting, that the Forest Conservation Commission looked at some of the thoughts that we got from others. Most of those comments had to do with our urban definition, which we revamped entirely to address those comments.
And I will say that comments that were directed towards us, we have been in contact with the individuals who made those comments, and we have talked to them through those comments. They weren't ignored or just adopted without conversation. We did have a back and forth with the folks who added those comments through the Woodland Partnership. But I can, again, like Scott said, yeah, some of that information, I'm just not sure legally if I can share
Sure.
it, but definitely.
All right, well, if they weren't public comment periods, these were just agencies, organizations submitting on invitation, I guess.
Yeah, so like Scott said, he done a presentation to the Woodland Partnership, and then
Right.
they asked for comments specifically through those folks.
Okay. All right, so looking at the same meeting minutes, there was discussion about adding a glossary of terms to the end of the definition for clarification. I could see some definitions added. I didn't know if that was taken on as a task or not.
Yeah, so that hasn't officially happened yet.
So that hasn't happened.
Nope. It
When-
will.
when will
It's not
that-
something that's part of this definition. So the glossary of terms was an idea that we had so that folks could know more about exactly what these heritage forest types are. There's definitely more information around when someone just says it's a mixed oak American holly forest. There's the percentages of tree types and things like that we're going to add so that folks know exactly when we say something is a heritage type or something is a core forest or productive forest soils. What do those mean and where do those terms come from?
I would say that would be valuable information at this point to include and out for public comment, because that could be a further level of elimination, maybe you want to call it a restriction of forest qualifying. So I'd like to see that glossary of terms. It was here. The commission will add a glossary of terms, and I don't know if they agreed by vote or that was happening or not. But I would think if you're going to do it, that it be part of this exercise right now, be included in the definitions.
Yep. So all of these terms are identifiable if you do the research on your own. So it's not like this information is hidden. The information is out there, and what we're planning to do is to further collect that information and put it as it stands within the definition itself.
Okay, my last question is, same meeting, there was discussion about should the commission add to the definition of no net loss for forests for statewide climate goals, and how would that work? And then the commission to present EC4 thoughts on no net loss. Hay Sales has an intern working at regional and other state no net loss policies to create a memo for the commission. Where do we stand on the no net
That's a
loss?
very different issue than this forest, most important forest definition. And the commission really hasn't done much work on that yet. So that's not really subject to tonight's discussion.
All right, I didn't see a decision. That's why I'm asking. Should the commission add to the definition? Is that, they didn't mean the definitions, the 4 definitions, they meant something entirely different. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Okay. I would just hope that for the public benefit in making comments, that all the meeting minutes get posted on either the Secretary of State's website if you're subject to the Open Meetings Act, your website as well. There's some corrupt files that can't be opened. So it would be helpful if that got fixed, because I learned a lot.
I found that too. I could only get going back to February minutes.
Yes, I identified that. I believe it was yourself or someone had contacted the Secretary of State. I was unaware of that because about half of the meeting minutes were fine, and then all of a sudden, some of them got corrupted the last 2 or 3 months. But I believe that it's been corrected. If not, I'll double check.
Yeah, it
I would
hasn't
ask you
been,
to
and I was
check.
going to write. Yeah, I did check today, and I was going to write you another email that, you know, I've notified you in the past, and so has, as I understand, the Secretary of State, to get that they were corrupted.
Yep, I believe I
is your
personally
commission
emailed you the
subject-
minutes, though, correct?
Right, but
Right.
there's a lot of people that would benefit by reading them that haven't attended all the meetings. I think they should be available. I don't know if you can answer the question now or later. If you're subject to the Open Meetings Act, that would be helpful to know.
Yeah, no, I mean, that was a mistake and an oversight on my part. I'm the one who posts the minutes. For whatever reason, the last 2 months have been corrupted. I'm trying to work through the system. I've done everything the same that I've done it in the past. I'm not sure why it happened, but I'm working through that. It just hasn't been done yet.
DJ,
Right,
you should
right.
go
Well-
back further than 2 months, because I could only get up to February.
Okay, I'll double check.
Yeah, and if you could find out if you're subject to the Open Meetings Act, then that would, I could squash some of my comments, because I'm big in getting the information out to the public so they can make constructive comments.
Yeah, so we are subject to the open meetings rules in the state. I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that, but
Well, there's a state law about the Open Meetings Act, and there's deadlines for submitting your minutes and posting them on the Secretary of State's website. And you've been beyond those deadlines. So that's not consistent with the Open Meetings Act. You're supposed to record votes. That's why I'm having a hard time reading decisions in your meeting minutes, because I don't know, was this just a suggestion? Was there a vote? Was a decision made? It's hard to tell.
yeah, so any of
So
those
if you
comments
go
that are,
refer to,
yeah, any comments that are unrelated to this definition, please email me directly. But tonight we're just focusing on the definition.
well, I'm not sure. I'm just going by your meeting minutes. So just need to, if you're going by the Open Meetings Act, just have your vote so it's clear what decisions were made, so we know what to expect in the definitions. It would have saved a lot of comments.
It would also be helpful to know who voted on what and how.
We
And that's
do, so that's not something that we have to say if you know, one person had abstained or not voted. You know, there's a
I think
who
it is
calls
required
for-
under the Open Meetings Act.
Sure. So we can have that conversation offline. Right now, like I said, we're focusing on the definition. I do see someone else's hand raised. Courtney, do you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to point to Erica's question in the chat because I think it's really valuable to this discussion.
Sure. So I did answer that question. Her question was, will there be any future regulations to protect defined forests or regulatory implications for land development? So that is not something that this definition is focusing on. And I can tell you right now that I am not aware of any regulations that are in draft form to protect any defined forests in the state, that I know of. I don't know, Scott, if you have anything else to add to that.
I'm not, and to be honest, I think establishing any regulatory authority to start precluding development on forests would be very difficult to implement in Rhode Island, or really any state.
As a follow-up, is there any potential to use these definitions in future legislation to be more protective of forests that where it makes sense?
So
Absolutely.
I'm sorry, yeah.
And that's one of the reasons that we've developed this, just like the definition of prime agricultural soil has been used in various definitions and regulations over the years. That's our hope, that these would be used so people would have a better understanding of all the forest in Rhode Island, what's most important.
Do we have any other questions?
Just to clarify, when I was asking you about parcel sizes
Mhm.
dealing with urban areas, you seem to indicate Warwick was considered in an urban area. Did I understand that correctly?
Correct, yes.
Okay, that would be news to some folks here.
To folks that live in Warwick that don't think they're in an urban environment?
No, I think there's a misunderstanding of what urban
Oh,
means
so,
when
yeah, so I guess, in terms of how the US Census Bureau identifies land, it's either urban or rural. So Rhode Island, essentially, there's a line that goes down the middle of Rhode Island. To the west is rural, and to the east is urban, to some degree. And I believe the entirety of Warwick, West Warwick, half of Coventry, East Greenwich, Cranston, all of that on a national level from the US Census Bureau is identified as urban. It's not a term that we have created, it's a term that has been established for the nation.
all right, I was thinking that all of those demographics that you listed
Mhm.
would have to have some bearing on what was considered an urban environment. The unemployment, the race, the
Right.
economic issues. I thought those were what you were talking about. Okay, thank
Yeah.
you.
Yep. So if there are no further questions, again, thank you everyone for your time. If you do go into the meeting chat, the first comment up there is my email. If you have any written comments, please send them directly to me. I will be storing all of those and then sharing them with the rest of the commission. Again, thank you for your time. We have been recording this. The recording is going to be sent out to the commission so that they can take a look at it as well. And I also see your comment there, Drake. Totally recognize that comment, appreciate the words. If you wanted to elaborate on that, great. If not, folks can have a good evening.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone. Appreciate your feedback.
Thanks.
Hey TJ, it's Amanda. I
Hey,
don't
Amanda.
I don't see your email in the chat, maybe because of when I came on. You might
Oh.
want to put it in there again.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Amanda.
Sure.
All right, I just put it at the end for everybody. Nope, I did it directly to Hal. Hold on. There you go. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Hey, thanks Scott and TJ for this. This was awesome to hear what you guys have been up to.
Of course. Thanks, Courtney.
Um,
Yeah, and I can get that data for you. Our Bureau
yeah.
Air Resources does that with us. We've been doing it every year.
Oh, that's awesome to know. Yeah, I think that's so Scott, since we last talked about solar, we've gotten some data from Clark University and I've been working it up, and I think some of these definitions will be really useful. We have a GIS person on staff who I think is going to try and take some of it and build these definitions into like a tool maybe that municipalities or land trusts could use to kind of make decisions as parcels of land pop up for sale or inside their own ordinance or bylaw creation. So these definitions are really going to be useful for us to kind of be able to tell people what forest is.
Excellent. That's good to hear.
Yeah, and I mean, as we get closer, I'll definitely reach out to you and TJ to make sure that it's useful. But from everyone we've talked about, that seems to be the best use of the information we have on where solar fields are, and combining that with the knowledge of where our core forests are and where maybe even our connected habitats are. So it's not just in the forest situation, but is there a good forest that it might not be core, but it has a really great connectivity to another part that we should be retaining for birds, for whatever biodiversity metrics we have. So.
Okay.
Good. If you haven't already, you might also want to talk to Paul Jordan at DEM, because I know he's been in touch with, I think it's John Clark from, is it? Anyway,
it's John Rogan from Clark.
John Rogan from Clarkson.
Yeah.
There we go. So
yeah,
he's had conversations with him, and I think he's done his own little analysis to sort of take a look at what he sees in his RIGIS versus those projections. So anyway, it might be worth checking in with Paul.
Yeah, totally. I need to check in with him again because the estuary program has that by state challenge. I have to go on a different scale, but I was really happy talking to Paul that he was thinking about creating solar as a land use classification. So now that we're able to track it, but I've been going back through ordinances and legislation, and there's a lot of information on like this, how the challenges of citing all of this. So I'm hoping, my question to say, like, will the state be able to use these definitions might be more advantageous in the second iteration of that new solar legislation that we have. So.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's it. I had you guys there. I was just taking advantage.
Thanks, Courtney.
Glad you did.
So I'll be in touch with both of you, and thanks for the data, and thanks for putting all this together.
Yeah. Okay. And also, I don't know if you ever talked to Joe Posha in Air Resources.
No, I haven't. I should.
Okay, maybe the three of us can have a conversation.
Yeah, that would be great.
He's got so much data as it relates to this sort of stuff.
Yeah, because as I've been doing a deep dive into the literature, carbon sequestration pops up as the plus minus to the solar challenge. So are we losing the carbon to, I keep thinking of it as the old phrase, cutting off your nose despite your face type of thing.
Yeah, and we've got some of that math, but yeah, it can show you what we have and what we don't have.
Okay, because I've been able to get some general stuff from like the larger national groups, but I wanted to see if we could get more local. And then, yeah, and I mean, you guys might be interested. Have you guys looked at or used like Massachusetts Biomap and their different ways of mapping and defining important biodiversity areas?
No, but I'll look into that.
Because the Harvard Forest and Mass Audubon have done a lot of really great work on this stuff lately in terms of what it means. A lot of the stuff is solar based because they're having a bigger push than we are in terms of how many fields are going in the state of Massachusetts.
Right.
But yeah, there's been a lot of push to connect all of that. They might have some really either for this work or for future thoughts on you know, if the forestry wants to have a bit more regulation, you know, on that. I know you have an intent to cut form that's not required, but
Right.
if you guys want to push some of that further, they might have some really great ideas.
Yeah.
So
Okay. Thanks.
all right,
Thanks.
well, have a good night. You guys did great.
Thanks.
Handled
Thank
those ladies very well.
Thanks.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care. Nice job, TJ.
Thank you. I'm gonna stop recording.